L'kutei Sichos Chelek Chaf Zayin Vayikra Aleph, the first Sikha in the new Sefer. We're learning the Lenishmas of Yosef Binyamin ben Rabbi Menashe Kaltman. We're also learning l'schus our dear friend Yosef Shleima ben Risha for a refuah Shleima Ukreva. The Sikha is from the Farbrengen of Yud Gimel Tishrei Tavshin Mem Hey. That was during the first year of the Rebbe's Takana of learning Rambam, and the Rebbe began to teach a lesson from the daily Rambam in the Farbrengen. And this halacha of Maisa Karbonis, which is connected to Vayikra, which is the parsha of Karbonis, was in that day's Rambam. Additionally, Yud Gimel Tishrei is the Yortzeit of the Rebbe Maharash, who is well known for his saying Lechatchila Ariber, to reach higher, to go above what the world says that you can accomplish. And in a sense, the theme of this entire lesson of the Sikha that we're going to learn today is the idea of Lechatchila Ariber, that even if you start out small, the goal is, and the real intent is to go big. Okay. In Hilchas Maisa Karbonis Paskin the Rambam. In Maisa Karbonis the Rambam Paskins, Hanoider Gadol V'Hevi Katan Lo Yotza. If somebody makes a neder, a pledge, a promise to bring a large carbon, and brings a small carbon, lo yotza, is not yotza, because he didn't bring what he said he would bring. Katan veivi gadol. However, if he promised something small and instead brought something big, yotza, the Rambam says he is yotza. Keitzad, what would be the scenario? Amar harei alai oila ishlamim keves. If a person said, I'm going to bring for an oila or for a shlamim a lamb, v'hevi ayil, and he brought a ram, or he promised an egel, a calf, and instead he brought an ox. He promised a kid goat, and instead he brought an adult goat. Yotza, he is yotza. That's what the Rambam paskins in Hilchas Maisa Karbonis. The makar from the Rambam is vigan gesegnet in Kesef Mishnah, the Mishnah in Menachos. The source of this Rambam is a Mishnah in Menachos. Vazakt, Mishnah says, if someone made a promise to bring something big and brought something small, as L'kuli Amal Yotza, all opinions agree that he wasn't Yotza. He has not fulfilled his promise, his obligation. But if he promised something small and went and brought something large, is a machlekes. There is a machlekes in the Mishnah. Lady Rabbanon Yotza, the Rabbanon would say that he is Yotza. He has fulfilled his obligation. Rabbi Emer lo Yotza, whereas Rabbi says he is not Yotza, he has not fulfilled his obligation. When the Rambam paskin vid Rabbanon, and the Rambam, the Rambam paskins like the Rabbanon that you are Yotza, you did fulfill your promise. Now the Rambam adds examples which are not in the Gemara. When the Rambam brings the Gemara is kaves, not in the Mishnah, I'm sorry. When the Rambam brings the Gemara is kaves, vevi ayil, egel, vevi shek, di vevi soil. The reason the Rambam brings these examples, well, the Rambam paskin that das was cotton vevi gadol yotza, because the Rambam rules that the fact that you can fulfill your obligation with something large, he does blaze and bay design for minachad. It's only of both, meaning to say the pledge and the fulfillment of the pledge are both from the same species. But not from two separate species. So a ram and a lamb are in the same species, and a lamb and a calf and an ox are in the same species. So therefore you could be yotza. Because the Rambam says so clearly later on in this Perek in Maisa Karbonis. We need to explain. How could you fulfill your obligation with a ram, for example, when you said lamb? In other words, if you didn't bring the animal that you had pledged, how could you fulfill? There's a pasuk in Parshas Kiseitze that commands the person to watch, to observe the utterances of his lips, and to do that which he has pledged. And as the Rebbe points out in R8, the Rambam actually counts this as one of the 613 mitzvahs, to fulfill a promise, a pledge that you have made. And since the pledge was for something small, for example, or a lamb, he has to fulfill the promise that he made, which as the pasuk says, you shall do as you have pledged. And if he brings a larger animal, such as a ram in place of a lamb, he didn't do what he had pledged. That's the question that various different mefarshim ask, and the Rebbe asks it here as well. How can a person fulfill an obligation for when he doesn't actually bring that which he said he would bring? So and we find two ways to explain this. Mitzad HaGavra, from the perspective of the person, of the donor. Given a cotton, when the person pledged something small, we interpret, we understand his intention as ein kavon is nicht gewen zu bringen davka karten nit king gadol, that he did not mean to bring specifically something small and not something large. Not as soll den bringen nit weniger davon. When he said I'm going to bring a lamb, he means nothing smaller, nothing less than a lamb. His intent was that he's going to bring at least something small. At minimum, something small. And therefore, if he brings something larger, he is fulfilling his promise, because that was included in his pledge. The larger animal was included because his intention was, I'm going to bring at minimum a lamb. That's from the perspective of the donor. From the perspective of the donation, we're not changing the meaning of the words of the person as we did in the previous paragraph. We're accepting that he actually meant a lamb and not a ram. Since there's a concept that the larger thing includes the smaller thing, similar to the rule that $200 or 200 zuz include 100. You can find 100 within the 200. Similarly, you could say you find the smaller thing within the larger thing. So when he does bring something large, he's in the cotton. When the ayil, that ram that's on the mizbeach, it includes within it the lamb. He didn't replace, he didn't change the promise, he just increased it. And therefore, this neder is considered as if it was fulfilled. So the question is, how did the person fulfill the neder? So there was two answers. Number one, that he intended to bring anything large, a keves, or anything larger, and therefore the larger thing was included in his promise. Or even if he didn't intend to bring something larger, but by the thing itself, the larger thing is inclusive of the smaller thing, and therefore when he brings an ayil, it fulfills his pledge of bringing a keves, of bringing a lamb, because the lamb is included in the thing, not in his intent necessarily, but it's included in the ayil that he brought. In Sif Beis and Gimel, the Rebbe is going to ask on these two explanations. It says, this is an insufficient explanation. To do so, the Rebbe is going to introduce another Mishnah and Gemara in Masechta Menachos that is similar to this din. And the Rebbe is going to point out from the discussion in the Gemara there that we see that the Gemara does not accept this concept that yesh bechlal meruba muat, that inside of a ram there is also a lamb. Obviously, figuratively speaking, but even figuratively speaking, the Gemara doesn't like it, as the Rebbe will show us. In the Mishnah of Menachos, we have a similar machlekes in the Mishnah in Menachos. Pirashti mincha shel esreinim. I said that I'm going to bring a mincha. A mincha is a flour offering of a certain amount of esreinim. Esreinim is a measurement, a tenth of an ephah. So he said, I'm going to bring a certain amount of esreinim. And I don't know the number. I don't know, did I say I'll bring 3? Did I bring 5? Did I bring 50? I don't remember what I said. Yavi shishim isarin. Says the Tanakama, you should bring one mincha of 60 isarin. 60 isarin is the maximum size of a mincha. So bring the largest possible mincha that you could bring. Rabbi says, no. Yavi minachos shel esreinos. He should bring a bunch of minchas, bunch of menachos, each one another size. One of 1 isarin, one of 2 isreinos, a third of 3 isreinos. He brings 60 menachos, each one a different amount of esreinim. So that way, whatever the promise that he made was, he will have brought a mincha of that promise. In total, in case you're doing the math, in total it means that according to Rabbi, he brings 1,830 esreinos of flour. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, etc. till 60. To explain the machlokes, why the Rabbanon say you bring one large mincha, and the Rebbe says you bring 60 menachos of 60 varying sizes. The Gemara brings different explanations. In the end, the Gemara brings the opinion of Rav Ashi. that this machlekes is the same machlekes as the previous one that we spoke about, where a person promised to bring something small and brought something large. Rabbanon savri cotton David gadol yatsa. Rabbanon hold that if you pledge something small and you brought something large, you're yatsa. And this person, even though he might have promised 3, and he's bringing 5, yatsa is yatsa. As long as the amount that he pledged is included in the ultimate amount that he brought, he's yaitza. So he brings 1 mincha of 60 yisarin. It certainly covers the pledge that he made. The Rabbi savar lo yatza. Rabbi holds you not yaitza. If you said I'm going to bring 10 yisranim and you brought 60 yisranim, you're not yaitza. And therefore Rabbi says you have to bring 1 of each to make sure that you actually brought that which you pledged to bring. The Gemara is mamshich. So on this the Gemara continues. Why would the Gemara Mishnah bring this machlekes if we already covered this machlekes? As we know that the Mishnah would not bring 2 machlekes in, even if the topics are different. But if the approaches are the same, then we could just learn one from the other. If Rabbi and Abanan have this argument by Katan Vehevi Gadol, they'll have the same argument by the Mincha. Why would the Gemara Mishnah tell us the same machlekes again? When the Gemara Efret Tzricha, Gemara says no, we need both. The eat marbaha by menachis, because if the Mishnah would tell me the machlekes only by menachis, then Rabbi says lo yatsa and Rabbanan say yatsa. I would think that here the Rabbanan say yatsa because both of them, the large one, the small one, you're bringing on the mizbeach hakaimis, as Rashi says, by a mincha, regardless of the size of the amount of flour that's brought, only one handful of flour is burnt on the mizbeach. So you would think that since, regardless of the size of the mincha, what goes on the mizbeach is the same size, therefore it shouldn't matter. So if a person pledged something small and brought something big, it's the same thing because the same amount is going on the mizbeach. Avol Hasam, but I might think, says the Gemara, by the karbonis, the konefishi emurin, that there's much more innards that are being burned on the mizbeach. If you have a larger carbon, so it's much more. The difference is much greater. I would think that they agree with Rabbi that you're not yaitza when you have pledged something small and brought something big. As Rashi says, emurim the gadol the fishim the cotton. The emurim, the things that are burned on the mizbeach of a larger animal, is more than the ones that are the small animal. And you might say that this is not his nether. This is not Bahuda Kaban Rabbanan Liyatza, the Fishi Emurin today. And if I would think that Rabbanan would agree that you're not Yaitza because the Emurin is much more, the innards, the things that are being burned in the Mizbeach is much greater. So therefore, the Mishnah has to say the machlekes also by the karbonis, that Rabbanan will still hold that yatsa. V'itmer bahi by karbonis, and if it would have told us just by karbonis, and I would say to myself, if Rabbanan say yatsa by karbonis, for sure they say yatsa by the mincha that the kaimis is the same. But I would think that by Vayikra Rabbi, that only by the karbonis Rabbi says lo yatsa, because there's a difference in this amount of the emurim. But I might think that by menachas Rabbi would agree with the Rabbanan that you are yatsa, because the kaimitz is the same, tzricha, and therefore you need to have both machlekes. By the karbonis, we have to say the machlekes to know that even though the emurim is much more, nevertheless the Rabbanan hold your yaitza. And by the menachos, we need to have the machlekes to know that even though the kaimitz is the same, nevertheless the Rebbe says lo yatza. So that's the Mishnah, that's the Gemara. Now, says the Rebbe, we bow that says the akos the kivan. Since the Gemara brings a thought, an approach, even though that's not what actually happens. Now, the Rabbanan still say yatsa, but the Gemara suggests that there's a way to look at this, that the Rabbanan would not say yatsa because he did not intend the larger animal when he made the neder, because the emurim are much more. And the Gemara doesn't counter that by saying, 1 second, the larger includes the smaller. So even though he didn't have in mind the larger, he had in mind the smaller, but the smaller could be included in the larger. The Gemara doesn't say that. Because of that, it's not logical to say, as later maskana, is a chiddush b'tamadin parvos cotton heavy gadol yatsa b'chal meruba muat. To say that, so why taka yatsa? Because b'chal meruba muat. In the previous, if we explained on the chefza level, why taka do the Rabbanan say yatsa? Because b'chal meruba muat. Because the smaller number is included in the larger. But if that was the case, the Gemara would have used that argument in this discussion. With the Gemara totally avoids that argument of B'chal Meruba Muad to say that Lemaskana, that is the chiddush of that Gemara. That Rabbanan say Yatza because B'chal Meruba Muad doesn't make sense. The Gemara would have brought that in this discussion. Well, Derech says Nidgatik to Zagen as a chiluk v'chiddush in the Tzrichese is as the Gavri Hachi Nadar. So too on the Gavra level, what did we say in the previous Seif? That on the Gavra level, the person intended to bring anything larger, keves, and anything larger. It's hard to say that. Now the chiddush is that even though he said keves, still it could include ayil. Why? Because he had that in mind. It's not what he said. So the Rebbe is asking a question on both of his explanations. On the explanation that the Gavra intended something larger, include something larger, the question is 1 second. He didn't say that. It's hard to say that a person meant more than he said. And on the fact that we said that Bichlal Meruba Muad, the Rebbe asks, the Gemara avoids that argument in the other discussion in Menachos. It's hard to say that that's the chiddush of this whole shita of the Rabbanon, and then the Gemara shouldn't say anything about it when the Gemara talks about it. So those are our two questions, our first two questions on these explanations, that both in the both explanations that the Rebbe brought in Sif Aleph do not seem to click properly in the way we understand the other Gemara and B'chal, the way we understand this Gemara. We also have to understand another issue. Late Beidei Fanamanal. Whichever way we're going to follow, either Aleph as a Gavra that the person was only talking about the minimum and not about the maximum, and therefore anything larger is included, or Beis that the larger thing that he brings includes the smaller thing that he pledged. Either way is Mistaber Leimar. It would make sense to say as B'shas Nodar Katan that if he made a neder, he pledged something small, I would think, according to these reasonings, that lichatchila a person could change what he pledged and bring something larger. And since the Rambam says that someone that wants to bring merit onto himself should overcome his Yetzer Hara, and he should be more generous and bring his carbon and bring his carbon from the best, from the choicest of that species. That he's bringing. Like it says in the Torah, the Hevel brought from the best, the oldest, and the fattiest, meaning to say the best. And it says that the fattiest, the best, the choicest should go to Hashem. We find that it says with regards to karbanos that a person should bring mivchar nidreichem, he should bring the best. The Rebbe brings in the ha'ara that if a person says, I don't know what I pledged, he should bring the best, because we presume that the person must have intended to bring the best, because if he's bringing a carbon, he would bring the best. So that we see in halacha that there is a concept of doing the best you can. Now, if we were to follow the earlier explanations, that the person taka intended to bring a keves or more, or the other explanation that when you bring something larger, it includes something smaller, that even though he promised something small, he should, or if not going to say he should, at least it's something worthwhile. He should bring something larger. A person said, I'm going to bring a lamb. I would think that since the way we're saying it, for example, lamb includes anything larger, then Fakarti should Tavka bring something larger, if he can. But the fact that the way that Rambam phrases it is that if he brought something larger, he is Yaitse, he has fulfilled his obligation, and doesn't say, Yavi Gadol. He doesn't even give a choice. He doesn't say, as the Mishnah says later about Nedava, that if a person wants, he could bring a larger one. He says yatsa. He's yaitza. Is mashma ados is nit kein lechatchila din lechatchila. Rabbi says yatsa. There's no din lechatchila. You should go bring something bigger. He should. It's just that if he did, he's yaitza. And the question is going to be, we have a brackets to read to learn, but the question is going to be that if the reasonings that we brought in Sif Aleph are valid, then why is it just yatsa? Why not lechatchila yavi gadol? Now, maybe the Rebbe is going to suggest in the brackets now, what are a carbon elevated? A carbon elevated is a carbon where the Torah specifically creates a sliding scale, where depending on the person's financial abilities, that's the carbon that he brings. And the carbon elevated is brought for 4 avedas. The aveda of a person who swears falsely, or he makes a shvua to not have to give edus. He says he makes a shvua, I didn't see what happened. Or a person who goes into the Beis Hamikdash when he's tamei, or a person who touches or eats maybe a carbon kachim when he's tamei, or a person who swears falsely. So the shvuas ha'edus and shvuas ha'bitu. Shvuas ha'edus is when a person makes a shvua to avoid giving edus, and shvuas bitu is when a person makes a shvua that is a false, that is not true. In these 4 cases, the Torah says to bring a carbon elevated. A person who can afford it should bring a behema. If he can't afford it, he should bring 2 birds. If he can't afford that, he brings a mincha, a flour offering. So over there, we're going to see that you can change in the middle. And the Rebbe is going to say why it's different. Okay, let's do it inside. When it gets to carbon elevated, das kommt auf Dalet Chatoim steht in Chinuch. When it gets to the carbon elevated, the Chinuch, the Sefer HaChinuch says as follows: as imu ani v'hevi kisba be'seira. If he's poor, for which he would bring his obligations to bring a mincha, and instead he brought a lamb or a goat, lo yatsi dechavasi, he has not fulfilled his obligation of the carbon. The reason is, since Hashem had mercy, had compassion on him, and exempted him from this larger carbon, it's not right that he should push himself to bring something bigger, more than he can afford. If he can afford it, then the halacha is he has to bring the larger one. But if he's taka and honey, taka poor, and he can't really afford it, so to push himself to do something beyond what Hashem told him to do out of Hashem's compassion is not right. So the chayda, maybe that's why we're saying yatsa and not lechatchila yavi, because since he pledged something small, we don't want him to bring something larger than he pledged. But you can't compare these 2 cases. Why? First of all, those karbanos are obligatory upon him. So the whole reasoning of the chinuch that Hashem had mercy on him only works on a carbon that Hashem is obligating him to bring, and yet being merciful of him and making him bring something smaller. But over here, it's his choice to bring it. So there's no such thing of a kelichamay that Hashem had mercy on him. He didn't have to bring anything. Base carbon asher v'ani over there, it's totally different minim. You're going from animal to bird, and from bird to flower offering. And therefore, if you were to switch, you wouldn't be just be giving something more expensive. You're going to a whole nother min, a whole nother species. Here we're talking something that he himself pledged to give, his choice. It's in the same min, it's in the same species. A ram and a lamb are from the sheep family. So therefore, the question is, why does the Rambam say just yatsa and not yavi? Move on. So from this, we must conclude as another cotton maintained that when a person pledges to bring something small, he does not intend to bring something larger, like we said in the first seif. The larger animal does not include the smaller animal. And it's a very obvious difference between the fact that we say that within 200 you have 100 versus within a ram you have a lamb. When it comes to the cash, it's a reality. There's actually, you have $200, you could take away 100, there's actually 100 that's part of the sum of 200. When there's makriv ashoir is indemnitot an egel. But even though a larger value includes a smaller value, but an ayil doesn't include literally an egel. It's a very figurative thing. And therefore, from the fact that the Rambam says yatsa, it must mean that he holds that not the intention of the person was to bring something bigger, and not that the ram includes the lamb, and that's why you can't do it lechatchila. But this brings us back to our original question. What's the reason of the din? How could you be yoitza? Now I know why he's saying not to do lechatchila, because it wasn't part of his neder. If it wasn't part of his neder, then how are you yoitza even with the evid? So those are the Rebbe's questions. Number one, on the fact that we said that the Gourarie intended this. The question was, how can we learn that if he didn't say it? And the fact that we said yes, b'chlal meruba muat. Our first question was that we don't see the Gemara acknowledging that as a reasoning. And then we asked a more overall question: if these reasonings worked, then why would it just be yatsa b'di'eved and not lechatchila he should bring? And therefore we say that these reasonings must not be the explanation, and that's why lechatchila you can't do it. But if that's the case, then why are you yatsa b'di'eved according to the Rabbanan and according to the Rambam who passes like the Rabbanan? See if Daled Rebbe is going to bring a new understanding in the whole concept of Nedarim. And till now we were talking about a Rambam in Hilchas Ma'aseh HaKorbanos. Now we're going to move over to a Rambam in Hilchas Nedarim. And we're going to understand a deeper understanding in the concept of a neder. And that's verstehen, Rabbi in der Kiseres from Hilchas Nedarim. We'll understand this by first introducing and understanding the Rambam in the heading of Hilchas Nedarim. In other words, in the beginning of each set of halachas, the Rambam lists the mitzvahs that are in this set, and then the Rambam goes on to explain it. So the Rebbe calls it the Kiseres. It's the heading. So what does the Rambam say in the beginning of Hilchas Nedarim? As the mitzvah is yishmei mitzvah vasav, the person should observe, should be careful with with the words that his lips utter. And do what he promised. This seems to be a long way of saying this, and it's redundant. To watch what comes out of his mouth and to do what he promised is seemingly the same thing. In Minyan HaMitzvahs, in the beginning of Sefer Hamada, where the Rambam lists all the mitzvahs in very brief, he says one thing: L'kayim other conversations that the person should fulfill everything that comes out of his lips. As we know, that the Rambam over there is writing very briefly and very concisely. And therefore, he only says the one thing which actually have to do. So why over here does the Rambam say a double expression that seems to be redundant and seems to not teach me anything extra? Even though the Rambam is following this pasuk from Parshas Kiseitze, so the words of the Rambam are paraphrasing this pasuk. It is the Rambam's style to quote psukim when he can. But it's very difficult to say, or it's somewhat difficult to say, that the Rambam would quote a pasuk even though it has no halachic relevance. When there's two parts of the halacha, and the Rambam uses the pasuk for it because it's more geschmack to see it how it fits into the pasuk, that makes sense. But if it's just one mitzvah to fulfill your promises, then why would the Rambam bring both parts of the pasuk? Therefore, it makes sense to say that it's not the redundancy. There are actually two elements, two obligations in the neder. Number one, that he should watch the utterances of his lips, which is consistent with the pasuk. And then there's another thing, that he should do what he promised, which is like the pasuk. What's the difference? The Rebbe explains, in Yed Neders and Efaran Tzvein, every time a person makes a promise, it actually consists of two elements. Aleph Dibur Piv, the Verter Veseret Arusgiret. The actual words, whatever he said. Beis, der Teichen von sein Dibur, Neder. There's also the theme, the intent, the content of what he said. And a very basic example, I don't know if it's a perfect example, a person says, I'm going to give $100 to the shul. So what he said was, I'm going to give $100 to the shul. What he meant, I mean, obviously, it depends on the person. But the person might have meant, I want to help the shul. The person might have meant, I need to give tzedakah because I need a bracha for something. We don't know necessarily what the person meant. But when a person says a neder, there's what he said, the words he said, what he's going to give, how much he's going to give, when he's going to give it, to whom he's going to give it, l'dugma, if that's the neder. And then there's what's going through his head. What's he trying to accomplish? Is he trying to help the poor person? Is he trying to bring schusim on himself? Etc., etc., etc. And that's what these are the two intents, the two references of the pasuk. Number one, there's a mitzvah to actually fulfill your words, whatever those words were. But there's also an inyan to fulfill the intent of your neder, which means that even if you said something specific, but you, let's say, had a broader intent, there's an inyan in fulfilling even that broader intent. And based on this new idea that there's two elements to the neder, there's the words that he said and there's the intent that was in his mind, meaning to say not just the intent of what he meant, but why he's making the neder, etc. This can help us understand the machlekes between Rabbi and Rabbanan. The machlekes of Rabbi and Rabbanan, whether a person who pledged small and brought big, if he is Yotzer or not Yotzer, it depends on how you look at the words Vasisa Kasher Nadarta. Rabbi halt as menechet sich nur mit mitzvos asecha dibur piv. Rabbi holds that we take into consideration only the actual words he used. Der Teichen an Neder Kasher Nadarta is mugbul und mugdur durch ein Loshen, was der Teres get piv. The intent is limited to the words he used. So even though he meant that he wants to support the shul, let's say, but since he said, I'm going to give $100, so his neder is $100. Mashayki did Rabbanan halten, as the ikir is vasisa kasher nadarta. Rabbanan hold the more important thing here is to fulfill mekayim and teichen neder, to fulfill the intent of the neder. Even though the intent might not be perfectly aligned with the words he used, nevertheless, the Rabbanan want you to fulfill the intent. Which means that if a person said something and had a little bit of a different intent, fulfilling the intent is the fulfillment of the neder, and the fact that it's different than the words you used does not mean that you didn't fulfill your mitzvah. So Rabbi holds you got to follow it literally. Rabbanan holds you have to look at the bigger picture. The Azan Lishitasayu. In the brackets, the Rebbe says over here that Rabbi and Rabbanan are following their shita. They're following their general approach in this matter. But we find in various places in Shas. With regards to an expression, to a series of words used either in Torah or in the words of our sages. Or sometimes it could be words that are used by people. As the Das Rabbi made it, the Rabbi holds that you take it literally with in the details, words as they are written. Rabbanan does not have to follow the exact words and all of the details. As long as it is consistent with the general intent of what was said here, you can follow that. As we've discussed previously more at length. The Rebbe is referring to a Sikha in Chelek Yud Zayin, where over there the Rebbe goes through 6 different machlekesen between Rebbe and Rabbanan, one in each of the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, and the Rebbe shows this Lishitase, how Rebbe holds that you look at things literally, and Rabbanan holds not necessarily. Just to give a dogma, so we'll understand how this machlekes that the Rebbe is bringing here is so beautifully consistent with the shittas of Rabbi and Rabbanan. In Seder Zraim, there's a machlekes between Rabbi and Rabbanan. Rabbi says that Krishma has to be Kriyas Shema, has to be said in Lashon HaKodesh, in the words as they are written in the Torah. Rabbanan say B'chol Loshen. Rabbanan say you could say it in any language. So the Rebbe brings over there that the Gemara brings that Rebbe says, it says Yiyu B'havayasan Yehei, you should keep it as is. And Rabbanan says, it says the word Shema. Shema means to internalize, to understand. B'chaloshin shel shemeya, any language that he understands. So the Rebbe over there says, why does Rebbe lean to this direction? B'havayasan Yehei. And why do the Rabbanan lean in their direction? Because Rebbe holds you go literal. The Torah wrote Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu in these words. You say Shema as the Torah wrote it. Whereas the Rabbanan say, more importantly is the intent. To understand it is more, I don't know if it's more important or just as important, and therefore if you said it in English, for example, but because of that you understood the words you were saying, you don't have to say it literally. You have to understand it. Another dogma, Seder Moed, where Rebbe holds that a sukkah has to be Dal Damas or Dal Damas. And Rabbanan holds, Reishei Veruba, if the person fits in, it's good enough. So the Rebbe explains, says Teishvu. Chacham learn Teishvu kein taduru, that it has to be a dwelling place. Now we know a dwelling place is dal damas and dal damas. So Rabbi holds if you're saying kein taduru, you have to have dal damas and dal damas. Rabbanan say it didn't mean literally the size of a dira. It means you should bring in kelim noim, you should bring in nice things. You should spend time there. It doesn't mean literally halachically taduru a dira. And therefore Rabbanan hold that even a smaller sukkah, as long as the person can be inside, you're yaitza. So I'm not going to go through all the examples, even though it's so incredibly geschmack. But you see that Rabbi is more of a literal person, a literal approach, whereas the Rabbanon are not a literal approach, and therefore when a person makes a neder, Rabbi holds meitzas lechatishmer. You have to do exactly as you said you're going to do, and it doesn't matter what you intended. Rabbanon say, now we'll see in the sikh in a moment, that the neder is inclusive of a bigger picture, and therefore you could be yaitza if you fulfilled the bigger picture, even if you did not fulfill the actual words of your neder, as the Rabbi will explain in Sivav. And the same thing could be applied till now that Rabbi was talking about nedarim in general. The Rambam in Hilchos Nedarim, where the Rambam is teaching us that there's two elements, and therefore there's machlekes Rabbi and Rabbanon. If you have to follow mitzvah sasecha dafke or vasisa kasher nadarta is good enough. Now let's apply this to the neder that we have over here, where the person pledged something small and he brought something big. He said a keves and he brought an ayah. If you're looking specifically at what came out of his lips, he said lamb. And as we explained earlier in the Sikha, we're not following the approach that the words of the Gavra meant. He meant at minimum a keves, and he meant more. That didn't work for us because it's fair to say that if he said keves, he meant keves. But if you look at the intent of the neder, again, an intent doesn't mean, I'm using the word intent, I don't know, teicha means content, theme, I don't know exactly the right English word, I don't mean what the person intended in his mind, I'm saying what was the background of the person's neder. The idea was that he was contributing something to Hashem. Where there is a concept of bringing the best and the choicest to Hashem. On. We understand, we interpret as Teichen Nidra is to bring in a carbon. We're saying he meant keves, but since the idea of his pledge is to bring a carbon to Hashem, so it's very possible that he meant any type of tzayin. Why did he say lamb in that case? His blame is that the maniyat said it's for a side reason. For example, he couldn't afford more than that. But the mechuvim for keves is not saying when he said lamb, he meant sheep, not because he meant at minimum a lamb. He meant I want to bring something to Hashem. I want to bring something to Hashem. What do I want to bring? It's going to be from the family of Tzayin. He said keves because at the time that's what he was able to afford. So now so obviously we said before that lechatchila, even according to the Rabbanon, you don't bring a bigger one. In other words, it's only that it's not liikuva. It's only that if you brought it, it doesn't hold you back. It means say you have not. You have fulfilled your obligation. So the Rebbe explains. The Rebbe that you look only at the utterances of the lips. When you bring something large, when you made a pledge for small, you're not yaitza. So that is cotton because since he pledged something small, he cannot fulfill his obligation by bringing something that he didn't say he's going to bring. It's different. In other words, we're not looking at the general intent. We're looking at what he said. He said keves, he has to bring keves. Rabbanan hold you look at the theme of the content of his neder. As we said before, that we're looking more at the second part of the pasuk, do as you promised, which means do what you wanted to accomplish. Even though lechatchila we won't say that you should bring the larger one, because after all the pasuk does say you should fulfill the utterances of your lips. So lechatchila he has to bring what he said he's going to bring, and if he said keves, he has to bring keves. But if he actually brought something larger, so now he fulfilled the second part of the pasuk that you will do as you promised, meaning to say he's fulfilling the content of his words, and therefore he does fulfill his mitzvah. While their prat from Meitzah Sasechat Tishmer is Nitlikua, because the Rabbanan hold that the detail of the utterances of the lips does not hold him back from fulfilling the mitzvah. So if he at least did kasher nodarta, he is yoytzen. Even Rabbanan will agree, do what you said. But if he brought something else, the Rabbanan will agree. The Rabbanan will hold that you are yoytzen. Okay. The Rebbe is going to continue into another prat in Hilchas Nadarim that will support and actually in the Lashon of the Rebbe make more geschmack this concept of the Rambam, that there is, when it comes to Nadarim, there's a concept of a sisa kasher nadarta, that there's another element of the content of his words that are broader than the actual words that he uses. Ubahaktim, let us introduce as follows. By the mitzvah say shaltera, the Rambam zakshei kaim adam nidrei. When the Rambam brings in the beginning of Hilchas Nadarim the mitzvah of fulfilling a neder, in other words, not in the heading which we mentioned earlier, but actually in Hilchas Nadarim, Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph, or actually it's Halacha Dalet. So Rambam says sheikayim adam nidrei, a person should fulfill his neder, bein shehaya mididei iser, whether it was a neder with which he was prohibiting something onto himself, he was promising to refrain from something, bein shehaya mididei hektish, or whether it was a neder where he was pledging something to hektish. Bring the Rambam say psukim, and the Rambam brings two psukim. The first brings the pasuk that we've been discussing till now, that you should fulfill the utterances of your lips and you shall do as you promised, which is written in Parshas Kiseitze, that is about donating. The Rambam also brings the pasuk of Parshas Matos that whatever comes out of your lips, you should do. The Chelek did say psukim. What's the difference between these two psukim? The first pasuk that the Rambam brings, is referring to promises, pledges made to hektish. But the other pasuk that says that everything that comes out of the mouth you shall do, is talking about Nidarim, promises that a person makes to refrain, to abstain from certain things. And as we see in the Parshas Matos is talking about Nidarim, when a person says, I'm not going to do kach v'kach. And over there it says, Kol Yitzim Piv Yasa. And in Parshas Kiseitze, he's talking about promises that a person makes to bring to hektish. And the fact, this differentiation, that Meitzah Sechat Tishmer goes on Hektish and Chalitzim B'Vyasa goes on Is Nidre Iser, is actually seen in the Rambam himself as a minyan of mitzvahs Reish Sefer Hayad. When the Rambam lists the mitzvahs, where it brings Nord the pasuk of Meitzah Sechat Tishmer V'Sisa, where he only brings the pasuk of Meitzah Sasecha and not Chalitzim B'Vyasa, Zogt as mitzvah is lekayim adam kol mashayetzi b'svasa mekar b'dzdaka v'geitz b'zeh. Rambam says the mitzvah is to fulfill the utterances of your lips, whether bringing a carbon or giving tzedakah. And the Rambam doesn't mention Nidre Iser. So we see that Chalitzim Piv Yasa works with Nidre Iser, which is why the Rambam mentions neither of them. And Meitzah Sechat Tishmer refers to Hektish or Tzedakah, as the Rambam says it here in Hilchas Nadarim, and as the Rambam does in Minyan HaMitzvahs. So now that we understand that there's two types of Nadarim, and we see that Rambam brings two psukim, we'll now understand why. Now, based on what we said earlier, that there is two elements in a neder. There's the words that the person uses, and then there is the general theme of his pledge. Let's move on. Now we'll understand the difference in the psukim. By nedarim of iser, of refraining from something, it uses the word yotzim mipiv, whatever comes out of the mouth. Whereas by nehektish there are two details. To watch, to do, to fulfill the utterances of your lips, as well as you should fulfill that which you have promised. So this was the chiddush of Seif Vav, that there's two inyanim and nedarim, and Rabbi and Rabbanan are arguing over this, whether you focus on the Meitzah Vasecha or you focus on the Vasisa Kasher Nadarta also. And the Rebbe is going to say, based on that, we'll now understand why there's two different psukim. Whereas in Nidrei Yisr, there's only one detail, Meitzah Yitzim Mipiv, and in Nidrei Hektish, there's two details. The chiluk between Nidrei Yisr and Nidrei Hektish is, why is there a difference? By Nidrei Yisr, Shavtzat Teichen Yisr in Gansam Tzadam Dibur Adam. By Nidrei Yisr, when a person promises or pledges to refrain from something, he says, this drink is prohibited to me. The entire prohibition is generated by the person's words. Without the person's words, a cup of water, there's no iser. Or whatever it is that he's pledging. Therefore, the only thing that happened here is he said something that created an iser, and therefore the obligation is to follow what he said. There's only one element here: the words of his mouth, because the entire iser was created by his mouth, by his words. Whereas when it comes to nidrei hekdesh, is pulas haneder nardi chalois. The chiyuv already agrees. The concept of carbon or the concept of suck already exists. Hashem created in the Torah the idea of carbon. What did he do? He extended carbon to this animal. The word chalais means to apply it. That the din of carbon applies to this animal. So really there's two things here. There's the chiyuv of carbon that exists before this guy was even born, and then there is the words that he spoke about this specific animal. So by nidrei iser, there's only one thing. There's his words. He created an iser that never existed. So therefore, all you have is his words. By hekdesh, you have two things. You have the idea of carbon and staka that the Eibishter put into the Torah, and then you have meitzas vasecha, the things that he said that this specific behemoth should now be included in this chiyuv. When we get at the Mal Barucha, the Rebbe is going to fear us in just a moment, but the Rebbe stops for a moment to point out, as was discussed in a different sicha, to explain the words of the Rambam. Someone who makes a neder kilu bana bama, as if he built a bama, which basically means he built the mizbeach outside of the Beis Hamikdash, which is a prohibition. It shows that you're worshiping other gods, or at least that you're not respecting the Beis Hamikdash. So in other words, as if the Eibishter gave you a mitzvah, gave you mitzvahs, and you're making new mitzvahs. And if a person went ahead and made a neder, mitzvah lishalal nidrei, he has a mitzvah to go to the chacham and to ask him to undo the neder. It shouldn't serve as a stumbling block. Now, in addition to everything that Torah said is usher, now he can't drink this water, he can't go to that house, or whatever, he can't speak to that person, whatever the issue is. So the Rambam is discouraging these nedarim, and he says it's like you're building a bama, and you should try to undo the neder. When does this apply? When you imposed a new prohibition upon yourself. But if the neder was, the pledge was to donate something to Hekdesh, it's a mitzvah to fulfill it. And he shouldn't try to undo the neder unless he has no choice. Like the pasuk said, I will pay the pledges that I made to Hashem. So, what does the Rebbe explain in Chelek of Tes? As bei nidrei hekdesh hat sich eine nidrei geschaffen, nicht nur achalois chiyuv shel neder, nur achalois chiyuv shel beteira, shel carbon und tzedakah v'kitzvah. That by nidrei hekdesh, two things are happening. Number one, there is a chiyuv of being makriv something to Hashem, or a chiyuv of giving tzedakah, and then there's the chiyuv for him to fulfill his promise. And that's why a person should not try to get rid of that. By nidrei iser, there's only one inyan. By nidrei hekdesh, there's two inyanim. There's the mitzvah of tzedakah, or the mitzvah of carbon, which already exists, and then there's the mitzvah of mitzvah vasecha, that he made a promise, he should fulfill the promise. So it's not exactly the same thing, but in Chelek of Tes, but it makes the point that the Rebbe is trying to make over here, that when it comes to nidrei hekdesh, there's two nekudas here. There's the nekuda of the pre-existing mitzvah, or chiyuv, staka or carbon, and then there is the chiyuv of mitzvah vasecha, of the fact that he made a neder that he has to fulfill. Under fires. Now let's conclude. By nidrei hekdesh, so we explained that by nidrei iser there's only one thing. Nidrei hekdesh there's two things. By nidrei hekdesh, so now when a person makes a neder of hekdesh, there's taka two things. There's mitzvah vasecha tishmer, but there's also vasisa kashena darta. As it's became the neder, now you can fulfill this promise if at least you carried out the general idea of this neder. If the carbon was brought, if tzedakah was given, then you have fulfilled the asisa kasher nadarta, afilu when das is nit genek v'mitzvah, even if you didn't fulfill mitzvah svasecha. So, in other words, once in Siv Vav, the Rebbe tells us this whole concept that the Rabbanan hold that there's two elements to neder, and a person could be yetzer with vasisa kasher nadarta, even if it's not exactly mitzvah svasecha. This explains the Rambam Menuchas Nedarim why he brings chal yetzer mepiv by nidrei iser, because by nidrei iser, since you're creating the iser, there's only the one element of what you've said, and therefore what you said is paramount, and what you meant or what's the general idea is not important with regards to the mitzvah of fulfilling what you said. Whereas by nidrei hektish, there's two different elements. There's the words, and then there is the general concept. The general concept already existed. You added with your words, you expanded that general concept. But if you fulfill the general concept, even if you didn't exactly do as you do, even if you didn't do exactly as your words have said, you're still yotze. And that's why Rabbanan hold you're yotze with the ayil, because it's part of teichin mechuvan and teichin nidrei, which is korban laHashem. And at least you've done vasisa kasher nadarta. Now we're going to go to the deeper level. Since the duas carbon is melashon kiruv, we know what Chassidus tells us. As a matter of fact, the Rebbe brings it from other Mekayros, not dafka from Chassidus, that carbon comes from the words kiruv, to become closer to Hashem. The idea of a carbon is that a person wants to become closer to Hashem, he has to sacrifice something from within himself. Yid wants to become closer to Hashem, he has to bring closer, and he has to offer his talents, his abilities to Hashem. And this creates a difference between karbanos and all other mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are the individual limbs and sinews of the person. The 248 positive mitzvahs represent the 248 limbs of the person's body. The 365 negative mitzvahs represent the 365 sinews of the person. And every mitzvah, which mitzvah means to connect, we are binding that individual limb or that individual sinew with Hashem. Whereas karbanis is not about the specific limb or a specific part of the person. The idea of a carbon is that the entire person should become closer and become bound with Hashem. This is emphasized according to the Rambam's explanation in the Tam was karbanis on mechaper, where he explains how could karbanis be mechaper. We had a similar question when Moshe wanted to know how the matbeya is mechaper, but the Rambam has a question with the all karbanis. A person did an avera, went against Hashem. What is the carbon doing? How does taking an animal and slaughtering it and burning it, etc., how does that atone for the person's sins? Says the Rambam. A person should have in mind when he does the carbon, he sinned to Hashem in body and in soul, and he is deserving that his blood should be spilled and his body should be burned. If not for the kindness of Hashem, that takes something else instead. The blood of the carbon in place of the sinner's blood. Nefesh tachas nefesh, this is the life of the carbon in place of the sinner's life. The carbon is in place of the person's body and soul. With this, he is dedicating, he's giving away his entire body and soul to Hashem. So we see that it's not about one individual Eiver or Gid, it's about a general commitment and giving oneself away to Hashem. Another area where we see that karbanis is an inyan klali, is more an overall concept and not connected to specific limbs of the person's body, and on that note, not to a specific mitzvah. The idea of karbanis is the same idea of tshuva. Karbanis is to get closer to Hashem. Tshuva is someone that either that's straight and now wants to get closer, or never straight but wants to get higher. So carbon and tshuva are very similar ideas. And we see it in the same thing as the Ramban. The Ramban is talking about someone who sinned and he's bringing the carbon to instead of sacrificing his life. But tshuva is mal b'kol mitzvahs, and we know that tshuva is higher than all mitzvahs. Which is why tshuva could fill the voids that were that became that became from the lack of fulfilling mitzvahs. So if Chas v'Shalom a person missed doing the mitzvah of lulav or missed the mitzvah, whatever it is, Chas v'Shalom, tshuva could fix it. Why? Because tshuva is a general mitzvah that is higher than all the other mitzvahs. And since carbon is like tshuva, so carbon is also this concept that it atoned for many other mitzvahs, and it has it's a more general idea. So the Rebbe is differentiating between all the other mitzvahs and karbonis, that every mitzvah has an individual connection to Hashem, and carbon is a general, overall connection of the person's body and soul to Hashem. And on this theme, before we get to the idea of Nadar Gadol, another Katan Levi Gadol, we're still on this theme of the emphasis of karbonis. As das ist echt eine von die Timing, was Parshas HaKarbonis hebt sich an mit Karbonis Aboy Beneder Benedava. This also explains why Parshas Vayikra, Parshas Vayikra, which is all about karbonis, begins specifically with voluntary karbonis, a carbon that a person donates that he was not obligated to do. As Rashi says right in the beginning, that this first section of Vayikra, the Keves Karbonai, Vim Eis Karbonai, is talking about Karbonis the David, the Karbonis that the person brought voluntarily. Only afterwards does the pasuk speak about the obligatory karbonis, such as a carbon that a person brings for doing an inadvertent sin. Why? In karbonis is was as following this reasoning that we've been saying since the beginning of this seif, that the idea of a carbon is about becoming close to Hashem, not just specifically, but overall. And that is not expressed so powerfully by an obligatory carbon. If something is obligatory, then what's primarily emphasized here is that you're fulfilling the will of Hashem. But when it comes to a carbon that a person is making the choice to bring this carbon, this shows that he's voluntarily becoming closer to Hashem. So all in all, in this seif, the Rebbe emphasized that a carbon is about becoming closer to Hashem, but the whole person becoming closer to Hashem, like tshuva, and like the Ramban says, that you're being makriv gufay v'nafshay, unlike other mitzvahs where you're just being makriv one prat. And according to this, we can explain, according to the Pnimi Yanim, why if someone made a pledge to bring something small and he brings something big, he's still yaitza. Nor canal der Inyan HaKloli from Makrev sein sich in ganzen Avegem sich zum Eberstein. When a person makes a pledge, there's two things over here, like we said before. There is the idea that he has a mitzvah to fulfill his promises. That's a mitzvah pratis. There's also an Inyan Kloli here that he wants to become closer to Hashem. Lashon Razal, the Rebbe brings a proof to this, that a carbon is about becoming closer to Hashem, and it gets some Lashon Nefesh, with like Chazal tell us with regards to the word Nefesh. Which it says by carbon mincha. It says Nefesh ki sakrif. If a Nefesh will bring a mincha. So the Gemara Menachos says, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Midar ki lavi mincha. Ani. Who usually would bring a mincha, a flower offering, a poor person, because the mincha was the cheapest kind of carbon. So the Eibusher says, even though he's an ani, and he's bringing something so cheap, I will consider it as if he sacrificed his life to me. In other words, the Eibusher says, if a person does a mincha properly, I'm being. So we see from over here. Let me finish the sentence. When a person is makriv a mincha, Hashem says it's being makriv his nefesh. So we see that the idea of a carbon is to be makriv the nefesh to Hashem. The Rebbe adds to another beautiful detail here, as the Esafa Maila and the Olav is the Mal Yusa. It's not just saying, oh, he only brought a mincha. I'll consider it as if it was something else. Fakert. It's actually being said as a greatness. As that Hashem gives the person the strength he needs. That the offering of his life is actually even greater than he could have done on his his own. And Hashem, Milo means to consider, but Milo also means to elevate. Hashem elevates him. When a ani, even though he's a mincha, Hashem elevates him to the point that he's being makriv his nafsha even more than he could have done on his own strength. But what do we see from over here? That there's a general idea in karbanis where a person is being makriv nafsha. When male is the kiyum from the mitzvah pratis da. So you have two things here. You have the mitzvah pratis of fulfilling your obligations. You also have a mitzvah klali, the tzavsa v'chibur klali from the midden. There's also a general concept here that the whole idea of carbon is kiruv akeches v'achushim and to be mekadev and to bring his makriv gufay v'nafshay. And when the person made this pledge, he's not only have a mitzvah pratis of fulfilling his pledge, he has an inyan klali that he's getting closer to Hashem. And therefore, what's primarily important here is the general concept. That the fact that he wants to become closer to Hashem and his entire being becomes closer to Hashem, and therefore, la halacha, you're yaitze by maybe gadol, because since the general intent of the carbon was fulfilled, the fact that he's being makriv gufay v'nafshi to Hashem, therefore you're yaitze. So that's the beer of Pnimi Sanyanim, which is very similar. It's very similar to the actual beer of the Rebbe, except the Rebbe is adding this concept that the idea of a carbon is inyan klali versus the mitzvah of fulfilling your promises, which is inyan prati, and the inyan prati is included in the inyan klali. I do want to say that there was a ha'ara earlier, ha'ara 42, which could apply here as well, and that when it says in Rashi and in the Rabbeinu Avadia b'Martanura that yesh b'chlal harbe muat, that the larger animal includes a smaller animal, which we to understand it literally was refuted, but spiritually it makes a lot of sense because the mitzvah pratis is the kevis, the mitzvah pratis, mitzvah vasecha. The inyan klali, the akravas akarbanis, includes the kevis. That when you fulfill your promise, you're actually also doing the general concept, or I should say vice versa. When you do the general concept of akravas akarbanis, then you are including the mitzvah practice of mitzvah vasecha tishmer. Yes, bechlal harbe muat, not in the literal sense, but in the spiritual sense. And based on this, we'll also understand the wording katan and gadol. In the beginning of the Aveda, the person is on a level of smallness. But since what's happening here is he's bringing a carbon, because he wants to sacrifice and bring closer his entire life to Hashem, and to offer himself, so what he's doing is he's bringing his entire being. He starts out saying, I'm a small person. What can I already bring? But what's he actually doing? In the inyan klali, he's bringing his entire being, gadol. In the shaychus zwischen Yireh Tata, Kabbalas Oil, mit Yireh Ilah, as it's explained in Chassidus and Tera'er, that there's Yireh Ilah and Yireh Tata and Yireh Ilah. Yireh Tata is Kabbalas Oil. I'm doing it because I have to. Yireh Ilah is the recognition of the greatness of Hashem. But when a person has Yireh Ilah, that also encourages the Kabbalas Oil. When the fire the heavy gadol, and therefore says the lashon of the Mishnah, and he brings something large. So not only is it like that when you have a matzav shel katnos, it's still something big because the inyan klali is big, but actually it's a leads. The heavy gadlos brings to the akrava v'kiruv gadlos. When a person wants to bring a carbon, he's trying to get closer to Hashem. It actually helps him that he should get closer to Hashem. That even in a revealed way, all the parts of him become closer to Hashem. And we know that when we learn the laws of the karbanis, so this is considered as if the person brought a carbon. Then Talmidei Chacham that are involved in learning the halachas of the Aveda and the Beis Hamikdash, the Eibusher considers it as if the Beis Hamikdash was built in their days. And from Kilu as if it becomes literal that the Beis Hamikdash is built. The Beis Mashiach says, "Came the Misham Hikriv carbon peil." And over there will be actually not Kilu Hikriv carbon, but we will actually bring a carbon. We say to them is that will actually be able to bring the actual carbon as the Eibusher wants. We say to the Beis Hamikdash Shlishi. So Yibana b'meheda v'yimenu mamish. So the Beis Mikdash will be rebuilt. Will actually be able. So all of this learning, we're now going into Chumash Vayikra. We're going to learn the halachas of karbanis, and now that we understand the idea of a carbon, that it's about to becoming closer to Hashem. So by doing so, we actually bring ourselves closer to Hashem. We actually bring we bring upon ourselves the time where we will build the Beis Hamikdash. The Beis Mikdash will be rebuilt, and we will be able to bring karbanis as the Eibishter wants in the most literal sense.